Welcome, everyone. This is the webinar series, Topics at the Nexus of Climate Change, Fisheries, and Blue Foods. The webinar series is jointly hosted by the UN Ocean Decade Program, Blue Food Futures, Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems, FishSCORE, Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems, SUPREME, Sustainability of Marine Ecosystems through Global Knowledge Networks, SmartNet, and Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project, FishMIP, and endorsed project Basin Scale Events to Coastal Impacts. There is a link in the chat to find out more about the hosting programs. This month, I'm delighted that we are focusing on the Blue Food Futures, from local insights to global impact. And it will be presented by 4 Blue Food Futures Fellows, Liliana Sierra Castillo, Gladys Mwaka Holeh, Ruyel Miah, and Aphiwe Moshani. There will be a time for questions after each presenter, so please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. So I will hand it over to our speakers. So introducing our first presenter, Liliana Sierra Castillo is a postdoctoral researcher at University of Rhode Island, Department of Marine Affairs, and a research affiliate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. For the Environmental Studies program. She's a Honduran interdisciplinary marine scientist with over a decade of experience partnering with local and small-scale fishing communities across Latin America. Her work sits at the intersection of science, policy, and community engagement, finding actionable, equitable solutions to the complex challenges faced by the people who depend most on coastal ecosystems. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Liliana.
Thank you, Joshina, for that, and thank you for everyone attending this webinar. As Joshina was introducing me, I'm a postdoctoral researcher currently with the University of Rhode Island, the University of California, Santa Barbara. And today I'm gonna be presenting and conversating on my current research for this postdoctoral research position. So the name of my talk is What Food Reveals, Land, Coast, and Ocean as Place in Fishing Communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we know, or I am assuming a lot of us in this webinar know, small-scale fisheries are very important for a lot of people around the world. Not just for economic importance, as we know, like livelihoods, economic sustaining, food security. You can click again, Claire. Thank you. Next, like the next click. Thank you. And next again. Sorry. But they're also very important for cultural importance, right? So a lot of small-scale fishing communities, more than just economic importance, they're also important for women, right? For culture, for relational aspects, kinship aspects, etc. These are some photos from my fieldwork currently in Honduras. Next slide, please. However, through time, the framing of small-scale fisheries has been a little problematic, in my opinion. If you click the next button for the animation. Thank you. So usually small-scale fisheries have been defined in a very patriarchal colonial mentality. And what I mean by that is that we usually have seen small-scale fisheries as these separated system where ocean and men, like usual fishers, right, we're associated as men, are the things that we're trying to manage or pay attention to, and we kind of like ignore, right, how the coast, land, and other aspects of these systems, and how, for example, women or other people also are important for these systems, right? And usually what happens is that we end up reducing small-scale fisheries to economic terms, statistics, or production terms. Next, please. So when we think about it, in this framing, we usually think of it as a space, like a geographic space or a territory, right? Where we can think about the ocean, coast, and land. You can click on the animation. And next again. Separated economic units, right? Or productive units. How can we manage the ocean, or how can we produce from the ocean, or how can we produce from the coast and or the land? You can click next again. But in reality, for small-scale fishing communities, when we separate ourselves from that framing that we have been thinking about, for them, these entire three units of production are connected. Next again, next again, and next again. So if we think about it interconnectedly, then the way that we have thought about dispossession, displacement, and thus mobility and or migration in small-scale fisheries systems will also change. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next. Yeah. So when we add some more more theory besides the space, and we think about place, right? What does place means into these interconnected systems? We can think about the relations that happen in these systems, right? How are women, men, and other people attached to the ocean, coast, and land, right? Not just for economic purposes or productive purposes, but what are their attachment, right? You can click the next. And so we learn, as I mentioned, there are interconnected systems. Next. And also, when we think about it, relational aspects between these systems does become highly relevant and important. Next slide. Yeah. So then dispossession, displacement, and mobility also changes, right? And how we understand them and what it means for issues like climate change. Okay, next slide, please. So why does this matter, right? We know that climate change is very important. It's affecting all the world, all the small-scale fisheries in the world. You can click, please. But something that I think personally we have understood wrong, and I learned this talking with many fishers in Honduras currently, is that climate change is just the tip of the iceberg that these people are facing. You can click on the animations. Thank you. And next, and next. Yes, so underneath this tip of the iceberg, we have issues of colonialism, coloniality, racism, policies that keep affecting these people that have been framed, right, in very colonial and like very patriarchal ways of thinking, right? We have tourism now impacting tourism expansion, the interest for lands, the interest for coasts, but also these people are tied in poverty, marginalization. They're facing physical and livelihood displacement, and added to that, they're facing cultural dispossession, relational dispossession, dispossession of their lands, dispossession of the oceans, etc. So you can click the next animation. Yeah. So when we're thinking about this way and everything I mentioned, then we need to start thinking differently what it means for climate resilient communities to be a reality, especially for climate change adaptation and relocation. You can click the next slide. Thank you. I bring on this slide again, and you can click through all the animations. Thank you. To think again, okay, what does this mean for climate change adaptation and relocation when we think about ocean, coast, and land as interconnected spaces and places where people live, right? Like not just fishers, but there's like a social fabric existing in these systems that are being affected by climate change. Okay, next slide, please. So with my research, I'm trying to understand this using food. Why food? The question, besides it being super delicious, you can click through the animations. Thank you. Food in Latin America especially is very important, not just as subsistence, or however that word is pronounced, but it also tells so much story of resilience, identity, and resistance. It is also a very interesting decolonial methodology to use where community members kind of become the narrators of their stories. And a lot of these people that are sharing their stories through food are usually marginalized, vulnerable groups that find comfort in their like spaces and place with food and wherever they're cooking. Next slide, please. Okay, so I already went through these. Next slide. Thank you. So I will finish this presentation by sharing an example that I've learned. We're going to talk about dispossession and displacement happening in Honduras in the northern coast of Tela through the story of Mary, which is a woman from Triunfo de la Cruz, through her use of coconut. We're going to explore space, relations as place, resistance and resilience of the community, and how these all ties to climate change. Next slide, please. So coconut, as we see, and in these photos, is a very important staple for Garifuna communities in Honduras, and actually for a lot of Caribbean communities in the region. However, with time, again, as I've been telling, right, all this time, because of this division of production units, coconut, because it's part of the land, and how we thought and interpreted, we just thought the fisheries were going to manage the ocean and the land. There's been a lot of interest to acquire lands for African palm plantations, for hotels development, etc. So, next slide, please. Coconut is now very hard to get, and these are just, you can click on the animations. Thank you. This is just a way that I would like to show on how, for example, the communities, they were telling me, they used before to get little rocks from the ocean and the rivers to kind of like grate the coconut that we see to the left. Before, they would also feed the coconut to the chicken, right? Kind of interconnecting in the three spaces as a whole place, where women were usually the ones in charge of getting the coconut, grating it, cooking it, taking care of the land, being in the coast, etc. Next slide, please. However, with time, and you can click on the animations, thank you. As I mentioned, there's been an interest in the lands. So now communities, as Mary was telling me, they cannot get coconut. They have to buy coconut milk from the stores, right? And this is a problem because, as I was saying, coconut is a staple food for these communities, for like ancestrally, for their food identity, but also for subsistence. And also, it's important because it shows how climate change is not just affecting one part of the system, but everything, right? Next slide, please. So here I also like this photo because you can see, and if you click on the slide, you'll see how coconut leaves are used also when they come from fishing. So for wrapping the conversation, I just like to pose this idea, right? How climate change, for example, in these areas, climate change is affecting land. Obviously, right, the lands now are being more floodable. There's more hurricanes, there's more storms. People cannot even harvest anymore, but they can also have land pressures by governments, by private company. It's also affecting the oceans and stuff. But the way that, at least in Honduras and in other countries are working in Latin America, we continue to think about climate change and climate change adaptation and relocation as how it's affecting the ocean, the land, and or the coast. But in reality, it's affecting these people equally in all these interconnected spaces and in their lived places as well. Next slide. And this is just a traditional meal. And I think I ran out of time. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lily. This was really interesting. We're now opening up the Q&A for questions. So you can click on the three dots at the bottom right of your screen. There's more, and you will see the Q&A option. So feel free to post your questions there. In the meantime, Lily, one question I wanted to ask is you described these communities experiencing ocean, coast, and land as interconnected rather than separate domains. So how does this holistic understanding challenge current conservation approaches or even marine resource management approaches?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Yoshina. Thanks for bringing that. It really challenges it all, right? Even from just thinking about how we manage a fishery, right? We think about ITQ or quotas or fishery management schemes, kind of like thinking about fishers and ocean. But in reality, right, when you think about an interconnected space and place, you think about, okay, what happens if a community, the women, for example, cannot access coast and land, right? To go harvest or go sell the fish or go sell seafood, right? It kind of like brings conservation to a different mentality, which I think we need to more than ever, especially as climate change, as I mentioned, keeps adding, right, to this iceberg situation.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll see if we have more questions at the end. For now, I'll move on to our next presenter. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Gladys Mwaka Holeh, who is a research scientist at the Flanders Marine Institute. She's a doctoral researcher at Ghent University and a 2026 Blue Food Futures Fellow. Gladys' research focuses on artisanal seaweed aquaculture in Kenya and its role in advancing food security, nutrition, climate resilience, coastal livelihoods, and equitable blue economy development. So I'm going to hand it over to Gladys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagea. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to the Blue Food Futures Program, the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, and the UN Ocean Decade Partners for creating this space. So my name is Gladys Mwaka, and I'm a research scientist at the Flanders Marine Institute. I'm also a doctoral researcher at Ghent University and a Blue Food Future Fellow. So today I'll take you to the south coast of Kenya, where small-scale seaweed farmers are already showing us what Blue Food Futures can look like in practice. So my central message is simple. Seaweed belongs in Blue Food Futures, but only if the transition is evidence-based. The transition is locally grounded and equitable for the coastal communities who are farming it. So this presentation is about moving from coastal seaweed farms to global Blue Food Futures. So I'm not only going to speak about seaweed as a crop. I will speak about seaweed as a livelihood as well, as a food system opportunity, as a climate change adaptation question, and as a governance challenge. Next slide, please. So why this story matters now? Seaweed sits at the intersection of food, climate, livelihoods, equity, and ocean governance. In many Blue Food discussions, fish and fisheries receive most of the attention, but seaweed is also a Blue Food system, and in Kenya, it is already connected to household income, women's participation, value chains, and adaptation to changing coastal conditions. So the question is not only, can we grow more seaweed? The deeper question is, what kind of seaweed sector are we building? Who benefits from it? And how can evidence guide fair decisions? Next slide, please. Yes, so my research is structured as an evidence pathway. Each chapter answers one part of the bigger question. How can artisanal seaweed aquaculture contribute to Blue Food Futures? So I start from the research baseline so that I bring out what is already known about the seaweed research and production in Kenya and where the gaps are remaining. Then I move to socioeconomic and value chain realities so that I can understand who is participating on this and how farmers benefit and what are the barriers that shape their outcomes. And also cultivation systems. We are comparing shallow and deep water methods so that we can understand what is technically and economically feasible. The later chapters examine the nutritional and bioactive potential, climate change impacts, and informal seaweed-based products and local value chains. So this is not one isolated study. It's a chain of evidence moving from the baseline evidence to community realities, to production systems, to value addition, and finally to policy relevance. Next slide, please. Yes, so this work is grounded in 4 seaweed farming communities along the Kenyan south coast, that is Kibuyuni, Kijiweni, Mwazaro, and Tumbe, all aligning at the coastal region. So we interviewed 158 farmers. This represents about 36% of the active farmers in the study area. So it gives us a strong community level picture of how the sector works actually in practice. So the important point is that this research does not treat seaweed only as a biomass. It treats seaweeds as part of a wider coastal system that involves people, involves markets, ecosystems, institutions, and climate pressures. Next slide, please. Yes, what the data reveal. One of the clearest findings is that seaweed farming contributes to household cash income. So in our socioeconomic study, median monthly households cash income increased from about $20 to $65 after the households engaged in seaweed farming. So this is a meaningful increase in coastal communities where livelihood options can be limited and seasonal. But the income story is not simple. The sector is strongly shaped by gender and market structures. Women make up the majority of seaweed farmers, which means seaweed farming can support women's economic participation. At the same time, women farmers still face constraints which are linked to education, market access, bargaining power, and limited value addition. So while seaweed farming creates the opportunity, the benefits are not even automatic. They depend on how the value chain is organized and whether farmers have really power within that system. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, this slide highlights three major bottlenecks that affect whether the seaweed farming becomes a truly resilient bluefoot pathway. The first one is market concentration. You will find that in many communities, farmers depend on very few buyers, sometimes mainly one dominant buyer, which is limiting the bargaining power and can keep even farmers locked into low farm gate prices. And the second one is about cash flow timing. Even when seaweed increases income, payments are often received quarterly. Like for households with daily and weekly expenses, it creates financial stress. The third one is weak upgrading. Most farmers still sell road-right seaweed, while the value-added activities such as the soaps, the powders, cosmetics, the food products or nutraceutical pathways, they remain limited. So this is where the governance become important. If we really want to support seaweed, or if we really want seaweed to support the equitable bluefoot transitions, we need to move beyond production alone and strengthen the markets, the payment systems, the farmer organizations, and local value addition. Next slide, please. Yes, climate adaptation is not automatic. So climate change is already affecting the seaweed farming through warming waters, disease risk, rainfall variability, tides, waves, and other environmental stresses. So one proposed adaptation strategy is to move from shallow water farming to deep water cultivations, where the conditions may be more stable. But my results show that adaptation is not automatic. Under current conditions, shallow off-bottom farming at around 0.5 meters remains the most productive and economically viable option for the smallholder farmers. But this does not mean deep water systems should be dismissed. It means they need optimization, they need investment, and farmer-centered design before scaling up. So in simple terms, climate smart aquaculture must also be farmer smart. Next slide, please. Yes, beyond biomass. So seaweed is often treated mainly as raw material for carrageenan or hydrocolloid industry, but it has broader potential. So my research also examines the nutritional and bioactive value of tropical red seaweeds from the Kenyan coast, which includes compounds like the mycosporin, like amino acids, fluoridosides, and phycobiliproteins. So these compounds connect seaweed to functional foods, nutraceuticals, cosmetics, natural pigments, and other high-value bioeconomy pathways. So for farmers, this matters because value addition could help communities move beyond selling road-right seaweed at low prices. It also matters for food systems because seaweed can contribute to nutrition, dietary diversification, and locally appropriate blue food innovation. So the next question is not only how much seaweed we produce, but also when and where should seaweed be harvested to maximize quality, not only quantity. Next slide, please. So one of the most interesting things about seaweed is that the same biomass can tell several policy stories at once. So from a livelihood perspective, it supports income generation and women's participation. From a nutrition perspective, it can contribute to food diversification and functional ingredients. From climate perspective, it raises questions about adaptation and warming seas. And from a governance perspective, it shows why bluefoot transition must address markets, equity, and policy coordination. So this is why local evidence matters. Global food policy must remain connected to farmers, to households, and the coastal realities. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. So I would like to close with 4 take-home messages. The first one is that seaweed aquaculture should be recognized as part of the bluefoot futures, especially in regions where it already supports coastal livelihoods and women participation. The second one is that climate adaptation in aquaculture should not be assumed. New farming systems must be tested for technical performance, economic feasibility, and farmer accessibility. Third, the value chain governance is central. If farmers remain dependent on limited buyers, delayed payments, raw biomass sales, the sector will struggle and deliver equitable benefits. So the fourth one, we need to connect local evidence to global policy. The Ocean Decade offers an important opportunity to ensure that African coastal perspectives are included in Blue Food, are included in climate and ocean governance conversations. So my final message is this: seaweed can help shape sustainable Blue Food futures, but only when science, when policy, when markets and community realities are all brought together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gladys. We have one question from Kristen. So thank you for your presentation. There may also be connections to seaweed-based biostimulants that can be used on terrestrial crops to supplement traditional fertilizer use. So she's just like mentioning like that there are climate benefits as this substitution is made. I would also like to add to that and ask you about the nutritional potential. You've mentioned that seaweed has significant nutritional and bioactive potential. Are communities in Kenya currently consuming seaweed locally, or is it mainly an export crop? And what opportunities exist for developing value-added products?
Yeah, thank you so much. In Kenya right now, they don't consume seaweed. Mainly, they export the seaweed to hydrocolloid industries. But there are some opportunities, especially when the communities gain knowledge about seaweed as a blue food future. That will be very good. So the potentials are there, but currently, they don't consume seaweed. And thank you so much for that question.
Of course. And what's one key insight from your work that international policymakers should understand? How can that change things practically on the ground for seaweed farmers?
For the policymakers right now, we need issues on value chain governance, fairer markets, the access to training, value addition. I think that is one thing that the support is required, especially in terms of policy currently.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gladys. And we are going to move on to our next speaker. Ruyel Miah is an interdisciplinary researcher focused on governance, equity, and sustainability transitions in small-scale fisheries and blue food systems. He completed his PhD in sustainability management at the University of Waterloo, following an MA in geography from Memorial University, Canada, and an MSc in coastal and marine fisheries from Sylhet Agricultural University, Bangladesh. Ruyel is also from a small-scale fishing village in Bangladesh, so his perspectives are always refreshing. So passing it on to you, Ruyel.
Thank you so much, Ashina, for the introduction. So hello, everyone. My name is Ruyel Miah, and I'm based at University of Waterloo here as a research associate. So today I'm going to talk about one of the chapters of my PhD dissertation, which is focusing on assessing the status and challenges of vulnerability to viability transition of small-scale fisheries in the transboundary Sundarbans mangrove forest in between Bangladesh and India. Next slide, please. So just to quickly go over the outline of my presentation, first I'll provide a little bit about the background of my study, and then the objectives that I followed, the conceptual framework that I developed, and the methods I used for this study. And in the results section, I'll talk about the food security and family well-being aspects of small-scale fisheries, how climate change affects their day-to-day lives, and the common vulnerabilities that they face in transboundary Sundarbans mangrove forest, and also the how the governing system works there and what are the relevant issues. And finally, I'll make some conclusion and recommendations. Next, please. So just to give a bit of background, we know that small fisheries do not follow border. Fisheries resources that span across political, social, and ecological boundaries that affects their governance, and in general, the governance system in transboundary system significantly affects small-scale fisheries. In transboundary fisheries system, small-scale fishers often cross the borders following fish movement or accessing nearby fishing grounds. Sometimes that leads to overfishing. Such border crossing also increases conflicts and competition between fishers from the neighboring areas. Uh, but the differences in jurisdiction, interest, and values in transboundary resources by different institutions involved both within and across the jurisdictions make the overall governance complex. So therefore, the vulnerabilities of small-scale fisheries in the transboundary context are not nested within a particular jurisdiction, discipline, or boundary. They are often connected to bigger problems like geopolitical dispute, making it hard to address in an isolation. Despite the contribution of small-scale fisheries to income, employment, food and nutritional security, um, across the world, they, especially in my study areas as well in transboundary Sundarbans, there is a lack of attention and also lack of coordination in terms of policies and action between neighboring countries is persistent. Next slide, please. So this study was aimed to assess the vulnerabilities of small-scale fisheries in the transboundary Sundarbans by analyzing the characteristics of social, ecological, and governance systems. I followed two particular objectives here. First one was to assess the vulnerabilities, and the second one is to identify the factors that hinder or facilitate the transition towards viability. Next, please. So the conceptual framework presented here was developed drawing from interactive governance theory and the governability lens. This framework helped assess not only the social and natural characteristics of the fisheries system, but also how they are governed and on both horizontal and vertical institutional scales, and through what channels of interaction between the governing system and the social system to be governed. This framework is grounded with the idea that societal system consists of three interconnected elements: the system to be governed, which is the transboundary fisheries system here. The governing system consists of the diverse institutions involved in both Bangladesh and India, governing the mangrove forest, and also how they interact, the interaction piece. Next one, please. So this study was conducted in the transboundary Sundarbans situated between Bangladesh and India in the coast of Bay of Bengal. The Sundarban is the largest single continuous mangrove forest in the world. The governance system in both countries comprise a diverse set of governing institutions. There are a number of different areas of similarities like resources, livelihoods, options, cultures, and social norms and values across the borders. However, the governing policies and regulations are still different for the Indian and Bangladesh sides of the forest. Next one, please. So the study was carried out in this forest in several locations in both India and Bangladesh from September 2023 to April 2024. The data collection methods was mainly a household surveys, key informant interviews, and focus group discussions. And also I analyzed them with in simple Microsoft Excel using the content analysis method. Next one, please. So the findings regarding the food security and family well-being suggest that there is a systematic vulnerabilities plaguing small-scale fishing communities with alarming deficiencies in healthcare access, infrastructure, and food security. Small-scale fishing is the main occupation for the majority of the fishers in both Bangladesh and India. High dependence on fisheries resources and a lack of or limited alternative income options pose significant barriers to their transition towards viability. Small-scale fishers, in absence of their main income, small-scale fishers opt for day labor jobs as their main alternative income options in both countries. Next, please. So the impacts of climate change are one of the key vulnerabilities that small-scale fisheries face in both countries. Climate change-induced natural hazards are very common around the year in both countries, with 90% of respondents from both sides of the forest reporting frequent cyclones, floods, and salinity intrusions are common. In Bangladesh, more than 55% of the participants agree that erratic rainfall has increased. Besides, there are a number of hazards that the communities in the Sundarbans face year-round in both sides. Next, please. About the common vulnerabilities that the communities face, the majority of the respondents identified that storms and confrontations with law enforcement authorities are the major challenges for them. These encounters often involve conflicts over fish they harvest, the permits that they use, equipment they carry inside the forest, and also the territorial access frequently exacerbated by the corrupt practices of the forest guard involved in the forest. The human-tiger conflicts emerged as a particularly severe, with nearly all respondents reporting increasing tiger attacks, in particular, in both countries. Next, please. So, looking at the governing system, the findings suggest that the current governing system is in Bangladesh and India are mainly hierarchical, with India's system is being entirely top-down, as all the respondents reported about the hierarchical governing systems there. Bangladesh is also predominantly so. Around 20% of the respondents in Bangladesh identified some sort of mixed or hybrid governance approach is in practice, combining both hierarchical and co-management. But these are mostly on paper. In practice, situation is different. As presented in the right side, the situation reveals that traditional top-down approaches continue to exclude fishing communities from the decision-making processes, despite their critical knowledge and stake in sustainable resource management. Next, please. As mentioned earlier about the mixed governance, it is true that there has been some changes in governance approaches, such as co-management approach was introduced in Bangladesh and joint forest management in India. But around 50% respondents in Bangladesh, they agree that there is a change in terms of hierarchical to co-governance, but almost the same amount of same percentage of respondents in India, they disagree about that. The majority of the fishers in India and Bangladesh disagree about their increased participation in governance. Next, please. So it appears that the main channels of interaction between the governing bodies and the small-scale fishers occurs through mainly policy implementation, informing the decisions, and non-compliance by fishers with rules and regulations. This dynamic reflects a largely one-way communication model where fishers are expected to follow the regulations without meaningful engagement in the policy-making process. Next, please. So I also asked the fisher people in both sides whether they are happy with the current governance systems, and the findings suggest that more than 70% people are not happy with the current governance approaches in both countries. And some of the major reasons include the corruption among governing bodies and the people involved on the ground, the harassment that small-scale fishers face in different means, in both inside and outside of the forest. They're scared of forest authority because of their penalty and different sorts of restriction and imprisonment. Poor management overall that they identified, and that there are too much of restriction in accessing the forest, both in terms of getting access permit and also several fishing ban throughout the year. Next, please. Okay, so to conclude, first, the study finds that the small-scale fishers face multi-dimensional, interlinked vulnerabilities. These come from social pressures, climate change, and weakness in governance systems. Because fishing in the Sundarbans is inherently mobile across borders, fishers constantly suffer at the margins, caught between jurisdictions, seasons, and regulations. In fact, most of these vulnerabilities are stem from governance failure, especially the inability to ensure adequate capacity and quality of the governance. So here's my key recommendation is that both Bangladesh and India must stop managing the Sundarbans as two separate halves. Instead, they should see it as a single social ecological system. Finally, the governing actors must actively understand and act on the diversities, complexities, and interconnectedness of these transboundary issues. So that's all about my presentation. The next one, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruyel. Our Q&A option is open. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask you, you identified a lack of coordinated transboundary governance as a key barrier. Are there examples from other transboundary fisheries systems that could offer lessons for the Sundarbans?
Thank you, Jashina. That's really great questions. Yes, the lack of coordination is there. There has been an MOU signed between Bangladesh and India back in 2011, but since then it hasn't been progressed. It's still just an MOU. So there are examples I have seen between Brazil and Bolivia, and also a few cases in Africa as well, in transboundary areas where joint forest management, not joint, like co-management approaches that actually help them to address some of the issues that the communities face, and also treat these fisheries resources as a single social ecological system with common policies and actions. So um, uh, I I have published the findings of this one, and also I have a details discussion section on this, how co-management, successful co-management, and good examples from other parts of the world can support in this area as well.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question. The study indicates that erratic rainfall is reported more frequently in Shamnagar, Bangladesh, than in Chabish Pargana in India, based on community responses. Have these findings been verified using observed precipitation data or other available climate data sets? Similarly, have other climatic variables been cross-checked with secondary data sources?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. And so the results presented here, these are mostly community perspective, but the communities has responded. So the household survey, we had a few close-ended response to all these questions, and that they have responded based on those survey uh, close-ended responses. But we also have referred, when I published it to the journal, we also referred to relevant studies, relevant findings. But I'm not sure whether exactly about the erratic rainfall that you have referred to there, but I can double check. And this is a really good point. I'll double check with what the secondary sources that published by the government, or also from other sources, says about the erratic rainfall and precipitation. Thank you.
Wonderful. We have one last question. There is a larger context of high population density dependent on the rivers that feed the Sundarbans. How does this affect the possibility of co-management, even the epistemological consideration of the Sundarbans as a self-contained socio-ecological system? So just very briefly, if you can.
I think I don't know whether I got the questions 100%, but my understanding is that the co-management practices are mostly on paper so far. It has not been implemented properly in both India and Bangladesh. Bangladesh has started recently, but India had the joint forest management back in 1980s or 1990s probably. So the implementation is still not there. The rivers outside of the forest community still has access to those rivers, but those who are that are inside, in Bangladesh perspective, I can say that they still need to follow those fishing ban. There are almost 7 months fishing bans out of 12 months in different durations in Bangladesh. I think I missed another question, maybe.
No, it's fun, and I can connect you further after the talk as well. Thank you so much, Ruyel, for your presentation. And I'm going to move on to our next presenter, Aphiwe Moshani, who is a PhD candidate and researcher based at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She's dedicated to advancing just and equitable and inclusive ocean governance and blue economies in the African context. Central to this work is a focus on ocean and coastal conflicts stemming from historical and contemporary exclusions. Aphiwe studies how the legacies of colonialism and an apartheid ocean governance regime have implications for traditional fishers in Richards Bay, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, who face restricted access, criminalization, and displacement. Turning it over to you, Aphiwe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for a very generous introduction, Joshina. Thank you so much for introducing my work as well. The work that Joshina refers to is part of my broader PhD study in Richards Bay that speaks closely to, in particular, competing interests in the blue economy and conflicts that arise and the implications of those conflicts in a post-colonial, post-apartheid context in South Africa, with it's being the world's most unequal society in particular. But today I want to explore some themes I've been thinking about in addition to that research that have sort of been emerging in the South African East Coast. And this refers to what I call the triple burden and its climate impacts, food security, and governance exclusions in particular. And so drawing from a part of this doctoral research in Richards Bay, I'm exploring ideas on sort of seeing how climate change, or arguing rather that climate change and fisheries justice cannot be understood separately from South Africa's longer history of dispossession, industrialization, and unequal ocean governance. Next, please. So the context of the study is the same as my actual PhD, and it looks at Richards Bay on the East Coast along the Indian Ocean in South Africa. And the slide situates Richards Bay as a site of overlapping ecological and economic and historical pressures, with some historical evidence of displacement and also dispossession along the coast in the context of an industrial scale development, which was the development of the Richards Bay Harbour. And so on the ecological side, indeed, the construction of the Richards Bay Harbour in the 70s fundamentally transformed what was one and connected estuarine system. And so here mangroves and nursery habitats were destroyed, and local fishers describe this long-term decline in fish and crustacean species over generation. And so how this sort of construction of the harbour had sort of immensely implicated livelihoods, and historical displacements also occurred. And so at the same time, these ecological pressures intersect with an aggressive and extractive blue economy industry and blue economy agenda in South Africa that's sort of seen as the silver bullet towards an economic repair post-COVID, and also alongside marine spatial planning tools that are aimed at sort of implementing a harmony and sort of conflict resolved idea of blue economy in South African coastlines. And so from this, we see large-scale mining expansions along the coastline, industrial corridors developing, with harbors in South Africa particularly framed as blue economy or oceans economy hubs and sites of interest. And so we see port infrastructure reshaping the coastline and oceans significantly affecting these livelihoods. And so what emerges from this is a profound contradiction, right? So communities living closest to the oceans are increasingly excluded from conservation decision-making processes, blue economy decision-making processes, and also decisions and governance processes that have to do with climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so while these processes, these processes occur while the communities carry social and ecological costs of climate change themselves, which manifest as constricted small-scale fisher livelihoods. And so we have a sort of hardening law around restriction in the estuary, which is sort of shown in the south part of the harbour, where communities are restricted in the ability to access livelihoods, and and with themselves as well, seeing both these systems, both the harbour and the estuary, as a collective system. They don't see it as separate in the ways that development and blue economies have sort of framed it. This all happens in the context of what you imagine to be an industrial town, which is actually zoned as such as a an industrial development zone in South Africa. And so spatially, we sort of see these overlapping and conflicting interests occur in real time in the context of South Africa being a country that is framed as being most progressive as far as environmental law and ocean governance goes, with its strong commitments to 30 by 30 and global biodiversity frameworks. Next, please. And so specifically the site of this research, which is these fishing villages alongside Richards Bay, the small-scale fishing cooperatives where they're barely persisting through these uncertainties, as I mentioned, is a criminalization of their livelihoods due to these sort of vague fisheries and governance and fisheries management sort of protocols and licensing regimes that are unclear to the fishers, which render them which render their livelihoods constricted in the sense that they have to navigate these uncertain regimes by fishing during times that they perceive as sort of low law enforcement time zones. And so to sort of avoid interacting with the law, as it's seen as a very dangerous site and a very conflict-riddled site. And so the communities simultaneously have observed these ecological change and as a livelihood threat, but they don't resonate with the idea of climate change. The climate change idea doesn't resonate with them and sort of seen as this global north, an imposed idea. And to them, the environmental harm is a lived experience, and they sort of see who are the biggest culprits, being the industrial sector, as the perpetrators, and in simultaneously feeling quite far removed from climate change adaptation discourse and practice. Next, please. And so my research really identifies what I conceptualize, as I said, as this triple burden. The first burden is this ecological change that the communities do perceive and the small-scale fishers themselves do perceive. And they spoke repeatedly about changing rain patterns, flooding, and decline catches and damaged estuarine habitats from what they've known historically. They described noticing these shifts long before they appeared in formal climate change adaptation discourse. And the second burden is a historical dispossession one. And so because of South Africa's coastline never being a neutral space, colonialism and apartheid spatial planning reorganized the coast through racial exclusion, removals, and restricted access of these non-white coastal communities historically. And so communities who once governed their use of resources and marine spaces through customary systems became increasingly criminalized and displaced. And these are communities who in particular use these customary governance tools from an indigenous knowledge systems perspective and from place-based knowledge. These systems and these ways of knowing the ocean have come in conflict with what climate adaptation proposes and conservation mechanisms propose. And so there's this constant hegemonies in epistemological realization of what actual science is against what indigenous knowledge holders perceive as factual. And the third then is this governance exclusion, as I said. And many fishers who told me during my sort of focus group study, they mentioned that although they are constantly somewhat, being procedurally consulted or spoken to about climate change mitigation, they rarely feel heard. And so their knowledge is often treated as anecdotal rather than scientific. Their lived experiences become secondary to sort of technical expertise and top-down marine spatial planning frameworks. And so climate vulnerability here is not simply environmental. It is historical, political, and deeply spatial. And that's why I argue that this historical injustice cannot be treated as an afterthought in climate governance and adaptation frameworks, because it actively structures who becomes vulnerable in the first place and who bears the burden of climate change implications. Next, please. So the next slide shows that this triple burden that I've identified, it doesn't exist as categories, but instead interacts dialectically to exacerbate livelihood precarity from a lived experience. As ecosystems become more stressed, access becomes more restricted. As governance becomes more adaptive to acknowledging meaningful cooperation as governance, as governance becomes less adaptive, rather, to acknowledging and meaningfully incorporating place-based knowledge systems, local voices become more and more marginalized in governance processes. And as historical inequalities remain unaddressed and unacknowledged in governance, communities enter climate futures already disadvantaged. So the result is this constricted local food systems and growing uncertainty around current food security and also intergenerational food production. And so when we speak about blue food futures, we cannot simply ask whether oceans can produce food and how they do so, but we also have to ask who gets access to those resources, and whose knowledge and what kind of knowledge counts as scientific and legible. And lastly, whose futures are being prioritized in this governance, in fisheries governance and adaptation strategies. Next, please. I've tried to keep my presentation quite short today because I'm quite notorious for speaking for too long. So I'll conclude here in sort of with these ideas sort of being developmental ideas and sort of percolating. The research does argue that climate change is intensifying vulnerability, but that the vulnerability itself has been socially and historically produced over generations. And unless adaptation frameworks confront questions of redistribution, recognition, and participation, then they risk reproducing the very inequality and injustice they claim to solve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aphiwe. This was such a rich case study. And I was wondering, as someone working to center African perspectives in global blue economy dialogues, what's one critical thing that international frameworks miss or misunderstand about the African coastal context?
Oh, thank you so much for that question, Joshina. I think the first thing that's the most obvious in the blue economy perspective is the fact that coastal communities in the African perspective don't assume and don't perceive the ocean itself as being a neutral space. They experience it as a very vibrant space that's not only important for their livelihoods, but that's also deeply spiritual, and that has customary meaning, and that has intangible importance that is often sort of in conflict with what is recognized as modern ocean governance frameworks. And so from the point of departure really has to be to sort of act as the design phase in policy frameworks, for an example, to acknowledge that there are these very sacred and intangible ways that coastal communities perceive and govern the ocean themselves. And so those don't assume that the space is neutral. And in fact, there's a lot of research that comes from the African context that sort of argues that the ocean itself is a political space. And so that these governance frameworks and marine spatial planning in particular in South Africa is a very topical conversation, in that it depoliticizes the ocean itself and sort of assumes these zoning regimes and these sort of demarcating borrowed from a terrestrial environment that assume that space can be sort of demarcated in ways that don't have real political implications, and ways that sort of evade that redress that is so emerging consistently, not only in global research, but also in South Africa in particular.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aphiwe. I want to extend my deepest thanks to all 4 speakers today for sharing such powerful, grounded research with us. The depth and rigor of your place-based work, spanning 4 continents and centering the voices of communities often marginalized in global conversations, is truly inspiring. Your research is making visible what too often remains unseen, and that matters profoundly. To our participants and people viewing this webinar today, if you work on blue food systems and are interested in the kind of work presented today by our amazing presenters, please visit our website and join our membership network to receive updates and participate in our initiatives. Thank you again all for joining. The webinar recording and a summary will be available on the FishSCORE website. There is a link in the chat for the website that will have the recording and currently has recordings of our past webinars as well. Our next webinar will be at the end of June and will focus on the work of the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project, FishMIP. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and being here with us today.